Ask most people outside the region to describe South Asian ancestry, and you'll usually get some version of the same simplified answer. One enormous, more or less homogeneous population. Roughly 2 billion people stretching from Karachi to Kathmandu to Colombo, sharing broadly similar features, broadly similar food, and most people assume a broadly similar genetic story. Even within South Asia itself, national identity often gets treated as if it maps cleanly onto genetic identity. Indian DNA, Pakistani DNA, Bangladeshi DNA, as though each modern flag corresponds to its own tidy, distinct ancestral population. This assumption runs in both directions, and both versions turn out to be wrong in genuinely interesting ways. Outsiders tend to flatten 2 billion people into one broad category, glossing over the staggering internal diversity found within any single South Asian nation. Insiders, meanwhile, often assume the opposite error, treating national or religious identity as though it must correspond to a cleanly separate genetic population, as if the borders drawn across the region in 1947 and 1971 somehow rewrote thousands of years of population history in a single generation. Neither assumption survives contact with the actual data. Scientists decided to test what the DNA actually says. The answer they found wasn't a simple confirmation of one unified South Asian population, and it wasn't a simple confirmation of clean, separate national populations either. What the largest, most comprehensive genetic analysis of South Asian genomes ever assembled revealed was something considerably stranger and considerably more layered. A population carrying genuine traces of extinct human relatives who vanished tens of thousands of years ago, built from at least 5 separate ancient migratory streams rather than one, and shaped by a social system so persistent that it has preserved genetically distinct communities living side by side in the very same neighborhoods for well over 1,000 years. This is the real genetic origin of South Asians. And it is almost certainly not what you think. To understand why South Asia's genetic story turned out to be this complicated, you first need to understand something about scale that most discussions of the region simply skip past. South Asia is not a small place. It stretches roughly 3,200 kilometers from the Himalayan peaks in the north to the tropical coastline of Sri Lanka in the south, encompassing deserts, river deltas, mountain ranges, and island chains, inhabited continuously by modern humans for somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years, among the longest continuous human occupation records found anywhere on Earth outside of Africa itself. Expecting a landmass and population history this vast to collapse into one uniform genetic group was, in retrospect, never a realistic expectation. It was a convenient simplification, and simplifications, once tested against real data, tend not to survive. The most comprehensive test of that simplification arrived in 2025, when a team of researchers, led by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley, working alongside institutions, including the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, assembled and analyzed more than 2,700 South Asian genomes, by a wide margin, the largest and most complete genetic dataset of South Asian population diversity ever compiled, published in the journal Cell. What this research confirmed, with a level of statistical power no earlier, smaller study could match, was that South Asia's population reflects roughly 50,000 years of continuous migration, mixing, isolation, and repeated demographic bottlenecks, a genetic history considerably longer and considerably more eventful than the story of any single nation currently occupying the region. Perhaps the single most unexpected finding buried inside this research has nothing to do with South Asia's own recent history at all, and everything to do with events that occurred tens of thousands of years before the first city was ever built anywhere on the subcontinent. The genomic analysis confirmed detectable traces of ancient Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry embedded directly in the South Asian genome. Archaic human lineages that split off from the ancestors of modern humans hundreds of thousands of years ago, and whose distinct populations went extinct tens of thousands of years ago, but not before interbreeding with the modern humans passing through and around their territory. South Asia's geographic position, sitting directly along the migratory corridor early modern humans followed as they moved out of Africa and eastward across Asia, makes the region genuinely important for understanding exactly when and where these ancient encounters took place. Denisovans in particular remain one of the most mysterious branches of the entire human family tree, known to science almost entirely through fragmentary remains recovered from a single cave in Siberia, and a handful of sites in Tibet and Laos, meaning every South Asian genome-carrying detectable Denisovan ancestry functions as an additional data point helping researchers reconstruct just how widely this vanished population once ranged, and how their genetic legacy continues quietly influencing immune function and other traits in living populations today. The scale and significance of this archaic ancestry finding deserves a moment of its own attention, because it connects South Asia to one of the most actively debated mysteries in all of human evolutionary science. Denisovan ancestry, in particular, appears at meaningfully higher levels in some South Asian and broader Asian populations than in European populations. And researchers studying this pattern believe it reflects direct, ancient contact between early modern humans and Denisovan populations somewhere along the migratory route through South and Southeast Asia, rather than contact occurring exclusively further north or east. Some researchers have even proposed that specific Denisovan inherited genetic variants may have helped early South Asian populations adapt to particular environmental and disease pressures unique to the region, though this remains an active area of ongoing investigation rather than a settled conclusion. What is settled is the basic fact itself. Modern South Asians carry a genuine, measurable genetic inheritance from a vanished human population that few people outside specialist genetic circles have ever heard of, embedded quietly in genomes belonging to some of the more than 2 billion people living in the region today. This archaic ancestry represents the deepest layer of South Asia's genetic foundation. But it is only the first of at least 5 genuinely distinct ancestral components researchers have now identified across the region, a number that has grown steadily as genetic sampling has expanded to include populations earlier studies overlooked entirely. The foundational framework, established back in 2009 by geneticist David Reich and his colleagues, described nearly every population across the subcontinent as some blend of 2 ancient ancestral groups: ancestral North Indians, carrying genetic ties toward Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and ancestral South Indians, representing deep indigenous roots on the subcontinent stretching back tens of thousands of years, with no close genetic relatives found anywhere else on the planet. A follow-up study in 2013 calculated that the admixture between these 2 populations occurred somewhere between 1900 and 4200 years ago, meaning the 2 population blend defining most of South Asia's population today was established long before any modern national identity in the region existed, and centuries before most of the region's major religious traditions had taken their current form. That 2 population model, groundbreaking as it was, turned out to describe only part of the picture. As researchers expanded their sampling to include populations the earlier studies had missed, indigenous tribal groups, communities in India's northeast, isolated populations along Pakistan's mountainous frontier, and the deeply isolated Andaman Islands sitting hundreds of kilometers off the eastern coast, a more complicated genetic landscape came into focus. The Andaman Islands revealed something genuinely extraordinary. Indigenous groups, including the Ongje and Jarawa peoples, carry a genetic lineage so ancient and so thoroughly isolated that it shows no detectable trace of the ancestral North Indian component found almost everywhere else across South Asia. These populations appear to have split off from the rest of South Asia's ancestral lineage tens of thousands of years ago and never experienced the later mixing event that reshaped everyone else. A living genetic snapshot of what the region's population may have looked like before that ancient admixture ever took place at all. The northeastern reaches of South Asia, spanning India's northeastern states and extending into the mountainous zones of Nepal and Bhutan, added a third, genuinely distinct thread: substantial Tibeto-Burman ancestry, tracing back to migrations that moved south from the Tibetan Plateau in southern China over thousands of years, operating largely independently of the ANI-ASI framework that defines the rest of the region. Central and eastern portions of the subcontinent, particularly the Bengal Delta and parts of central India, revealed a fourth thread entirely: Austroasiatic ancestry, connected to ancient rice farming populations who migrated westward out of Southeast Asia several thousand years ago, leaving behind a genetic signature traceable through the specific Y chromosome haplogroup O2A-M95, found today at meaningfully elevated frequencies across Bengali populations on both sides of the modern India-Bangladesh border, and reaching its most concentrated expression among indigenous communities like the Santals, where East Asian-related ancestry can climb as high as 35 to 50% of total genetic composition. By the time researchers accounted for archaic Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, ancestral North Indian ancestry, ancestral South Indian ancestry, the deeply isolated Andamanese lineage, Tibeto-Burman ancestry, and Austroasiatic ancestry, the simple 2-population model from 2009 had expanded into a genuinely complex, at least 5-component ancestral framework. And researchers now acknowledge that even this expanded model likely understates the true complexity, given how many regional and tribal populations across South Asia still remain only partially sampled. The real breakthrough in understanding exactly how and when these ancestral streams actually converged came not from studying living populations at all, but from digging directly into the ground. In 2019, archaeologists excavating a burial site at Rakhigarhi in the Indian state of Haryana recovered skeletal remains from the Indus Valley Civilization dating back roughly 5,000 years, genuinely rare, well-preserved ancient DNA from a region whose hot, humid climate typically destroys genetic material long before researchers get the chance to study it. When scientists finally sequenced the genome, publishing their findings alongside a companion study analyzing 524 ancient individuals across Central and South Asia, the results settled a decades-old academic debate that linguistic evidence alone had never been able to resolve. One competing theory had proposed that farming and Indo-European languages spread into South Asia together, carried by the same population of Anatolian farmers, responsible for spreading agriculture across Europe. The ancient DNA ruled this out directly. The Rakhigarhi individual, representing the Indus Valley Civilization firsthand, showed no substantial connection to Anatolian farming populations, and critically lacked the steppe-related genetic component that would only arrive in the region later, after the Indus Valley's own decline. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a more specific mechanism. A subgroup of ancient steppe pastoralist populations, moving out of the grasslands north of the Caucasus and Central Asia, arrived in South Asia after the Indus Valley Civilization had already collapsed, and became linked to the later spread of Indo-European languages across the northern subcontinent. This steppe-related genetic signature shows up today, concentrated most heavily among northern South Asian populations, particularly certain Brahmin and traditionally priestly communities, and drops off gradually moving south and east. Exactly the pattern the original 2009 ANI-ASI framework had predicted, now confirmed directly through ancient DNA rather than inferred indirectly from modern populations alone. Here is where South Asian genetics reveals a pattern most popular discussions of ancestry never mention at all. A genuine mismatch between what the paternal genetic record shows and what the maternal genetic record shows across huge swaths of the region. When researchers separate Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son from mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to daughter, they find that paternal lineages across much of northern and in northwestern South Asia point overwhelmingly toward relatively recent Central Asian and Iranian-related migration, with markers like haplogroup R1A reaching frequencies far higher than gradual, balanced population mixing alone would produce. But the maternal line across these same populations tells an almost entirely different story. Mitochondrial DNA remains overwhelmingly rooted in ancient indigenous South Asian lineages, some tracing back 40 to 60,000 years to among the very earliest human populations to settle the subcontinent after the migration out of Africa. This pattern, a strong paternal signal from incoming migrants, paired with an overwhelmingly indigenous maternal record, is what population geneticists call sex-biased admixture, and it points toward a specific, repeated historical process playing out across generations. Incoming groups of men, whether Bronze Age, steppe pastoralists, or later Central Asian migrants, settling among and having children with local women whose own ancestry had already been established on the subcontinent for tens of thousands of years. This precise pattern has now been documented repeatedly across specific South Asian populations. In Punjab, where Jat communities show some of the highest steppe-related paternal ancestry found anywhere in the region, alongside overwhelmingly indigenous maternal lineages. Among Rajput communities, whose genetic profile reflects centuries of exactly this kind of sex-biased mixing layered with genuine internal diversity, researchers describe as a mosaic rather than a single bloodline. And even among the Romani people of Europe, whose ancestors left northwestern South Asia roughly 1,500 years ago, carrying a founding paternal lineage most closely related to populations specifically from Rajasthan and Punjab. Caste and community structure add an entirely separate axis of complexity that cuts across every regional and migratory pattern described so far, and it's one of the clearest ways South Asia's genetic reality diverges from any simple, unified narrative. The region is home to more than 4,000 distinct endogamous communities, groups that have, for religious, caste, or social reasons, married almost exclusively within their own community for generation after generation, in many cases for well over 1,000 years. In most parts of the world, thousands of years of regional contact and trade would gradually blend distinct ancestral genetic signals into a smoother, more homogeneous population. Across South Asia, the opposite happened. This extraordinarily persistent pattern of endogamy acted like a genetic time capsule, preserving ancient ancestry proportions with a clarity researchers rarely find anywhere else in the world. It's precisely why two communities living in the same South Asian city, speaking the same regional language, sharing the same neighborhood for centuries, can carry meaningfully different ancestral ratios, different dominant haplogroups, and in some documented cases, a genetic distance between them larger than the distance separating certain populations living in entirely different countries. To see how dramatically this endogamy effect actually plays out, it helps to look at concrete, documented examples rather than abstract averages. Researchers studying populations across just a single Indian state have found that different caste communities living within the same district, sharing the same regional language, the same climate, the same local cuisine, and often the same neighborhoods, can carry measurably different ancestral ratios, differences large enough to reliably distinguish one community's genetic profile from another's using standard population genetics techniques. Brahmin communities across northern South Asia consistently show among the highest steppe-related ancestry proportions of any group studied, while many historically marginalized communities in the very same regions show measurably higher indigenous South Asian ancestry, reflecting centuries of social separation that left a genuine, measurable biological signature layered directly on top of shared language and shared geography. The same endogamy has produced consequences extending well beyond academic population genetics, into the realm of public health across the entire region. Because so many endogamous communities have maintained closed marriage networks for centuries, researchers have documented elevated rates of specific recessive genetic disorders, concentrated within particular caste and community groups, directly tied to consanguineous marriage rates that, in parts of Pakistan specifically, have been estimated at 40 to 60% of all unions, among the highest rates recorded anywhere in the world. The same demographic pattern, researchers discovered through Pakistan's landmark Genome Resource Project, analyzing more than 170,000 genomes, has produced the largest documented collection of naturally occurring gene knockouts found in any population on Earth, offering global medical research a genuinely unique window into human gene function that populations with lower consanguinity rates simply cannot provide at the same scale. It's worth pausing to consider just how badly South Asia has been underrepresented in the global genetic research that shapes modern medicine, because this underrepresentation is precisely what makes projects like the 2,700 genome cell study, India's Genome India project, and Pakistan's Genome Resource so urgently necessary. South Asians collectively make up nearly 25% of the entire world's population, yet for decades represented barely 2% of the genetic data contained in the world's major genomic databases, a mismatch with direct, measurable consequences for how well modern medicine actually serves well over 2 billion people. Genetic reference databases built almost entirely from European populations have, for years, produced disease risk calculations and drug dosage guidelines that simply don't translate accurately to South Asian genetic backgrounds. Correcting that gap isn't simply an academic exercise. It's a genuine ongoing medical necessity that these expanding research projects are only now beginning to address. It's worth pausing to consider just how badly South Asia has been underrepresented in the global genetic research that shapes modern medicine, because this underrepresentation is precisely what makes projects like the 2,700 genome cell study, India's Genome India project, and Pakistan's Genome Resource so urgently necessary. South Asians collectively make up nearly 25% of the entire world's population, yet for decades represented barely 2% of the genetic data contained in the world's major genomic databases, a mismatch with direct, measurable consequences for how well modern medicine actually serves well over 2 billion people. Genetic reference databases, built almost entirely from European populations, have, for years, produced disease risk calculations and drug dosage guidelines that simply don't translate accurately to South Asian genetic backgrounds. Correcting that gap isn't simply an academic exercise. It's a genuine, ongoing medical necessity that these expanding research projects are only now beginning to address. The same wave of research has, almost as a byproduct, produced one of the most consistent and genuinely surprising findings in all of South Asian population genetics, that the modern political borders carved across the region in the 20th century line up remarkably poorly with the deeper genetic map underneath them. Punjabi Jat Sikh communities in India and Punjabi Jat communities in Pakistan remain genetically nearly indistinguishable from one another, despite nearly 80 years of separation, differing national citizenship, and in many cases, differing religious practice following the trauma of 1947. A 2026 study comparing Sindhi Hindu populations in India against Sindhi Muslim populations still living in Sindh, Pakistan, found 60 to 66% shared ancestry tracing directly back to the ancient Indus Valley Civilization, persisting across that same partition line. Bengali populations in India's West Bengal and in Bangladesh, despite being divided not once but twice across the 20th century, first in 1947 and again in the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, continue to cluster together genetically, sharing the same distinctive three-way ancestral mixture of ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian, and Southeast Asian genetic components, found nowhere else in comparable proportion. And Balak populations straddling the border between Pakistan and Iran show genetic distance so small that researchers describe it as statistically close to zero, a level of continuity normally reserved for populations living within the very same country, found instead spanning an international frontier. None of this scientific complexity erases the reality of the modern national and cultural identities built across South Asia over the past century. India's democratic project, uniting an extraordinary range of linguistic and religious communities, Pakistan's founding around shared religious and political identity, Bangladesh's hard-won independence built around Bengali linguistic identity, and the distinct national stories of Nepal and Sri Lanka besides. Genetic ancestry doesn't compete with or diminish any of these achievements. What the science reveals is that every one of these modern nations was built from a population considerably more genetically layered than any single founding narrative typically acknowledges. A genuine federation of ancient lineages, including archaic human ancestry, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, Bronze Age steppe herders, ancient Iranian farmers, indigenous hunter-gatherers whose roots run tens of thousands of years deep, migrants from Tibet and Southeast Asia, and isolated island populations, carrying some of the oldest, continuously present human DNA found anywhere on Earth. For scientists, that is the real result buried inside South Asian DNA. Not one unified population sharing a single origin story, and not a set of cleanly separate national populations divided along modern political lines either, but something considerably more interesting. A region whose 50,000-year population history simply never organized itself according to the boundaries later drawn across it, whether those boundaries were drawn by ancient migration corridors, medieval kingdoms, colonial administrators, or 20th century partition. The deepest genetic connections keep running straight through modern borders rather than respecting them. Punjabi communities remaining nearly indistinguishable across the India-Pakistan divide, Sindhi and Bengali populations sharing 60% or more ancestry across their own respective partitions, and Balak communities showing genetic distance close to statistical zero across the Iran-Pakistan frontier. Every one of these findings, emerging from separate research teams working on separate populations years apart, keeps confirming the exact same underlying truth, that the map most people carry in their heads of South Asian identity, built around modern flags and modern borders, was never going to match the considerably older, considerably more patient map written into the region's DNA. That is the real genetic origin of South Asians. Not a single people, and not simply several separate peoples either, but an extraordinary 50,000-year mosaic. Archaic human ancestry inherited from relatives who vanished tens of thousands of years before recorded history began. Ancient hunter-gatherers whose lineage never left. Farmers who arrived from the Iranian Plateau. Herders who arrived later from the Central Asian steppe. Migrants who crossed the eastern Himalayas from Tibet and Southeast Asia. And thousands of endogamous communities who spent the last several thousand years carefully preserving every one of these ancient threads in remarkably legible detail. A population, in the end, considerably older, considerably more layered, and considerably more scientifically remarkable than any simple story about who belongs to which modern flag was ever going to fully capture. 2 billion people, one shared corner of the planet, and a genetic history so long and so deeply layered that even the largest study ever conducted on it, spanning more than 2,700 genomes, likely represents only the beginning of everything South Asian DNA still has left to reveal.